Rubble's kennel lurched violently, another powerful slam ricocheting off the inner walls. Zuma jumped backward, confused and terrified, feral instincts screaming at him to run, yet he remained paralyzed in fear. Marshall and Rocky quickly withdrew back into their own kennels as the noise sounded again. Whatever was inside Rubble's den, it was angry and powerful, charging itself into every surface to break free from the prison. The shuttered door that acted as the entrance to the kennel was meaningless. A display of power was in order. The creature wanted to break out, tear down the walls, and rip its scaffolding to shreds. It wasn't just a desire to escape, it wanted to reveal itself. Chase could hardly believe what he was hearing, and with every effort in his small body, he pushed back the crippling horror inside and called out to the Labrador. "Zuma, get back!" The lab finally came to, snapping back to reality as he shook his head. He quickly turned tail and ran, charging away from the kennel and diving into his own. Chase took a few steps back, looking to the door of the tower, mind racing if he could get there in time. Another bang. The kennel's walls began to jut out awkwardly, slightly bending. A lingering feeling began to possess the air around them, a horrific streak of confusion and terror. Chase's heartbeat skipped over itself, its own thumps feeling like punches to the head, his breathing intensifying as his mind fought to keep control of his body. His vision seemed to blur, but this time, he knew he wasn't going crazy. Ferox's malice was real. He couldn't abandon his friends, not now. Holding his breath, the shepherd turned and charged as fast as he could to Marshall's kennel. The Dalmatian was cowering in the back, keeping his face hidden in his paws as if looking up was a death sentence. Chase entered the kennel swiftly and nearly threw himself against the wall, almost flattening himself against it. His heart beating like mad, he slowly moved his head, looking out from the firefighter's den. The banging had stopped, and the creature went silent. What was Ferox's malice? Dog? Human? He thought back to the image Cyrus had slipped him so long ago. He remembered seeing what he only assumed was a normal dog. Only the head was visible in the photo, but it was assumed to be the only part of the body intact. Everything from the neck down was all bone, blood, veins, and muscle. That was what Cyrus had said. Chase couldn't say anything from his view, just the still standing kennel that had belonged to a now deceased bulldog. "What's it doing?" Chase muttered to himself, daring to push himself a little farther out. The noise had gone silent. Was the monster truly unable to escape the kennel? "Chase!" he heard behind him, nearly making him jump. Marshall had picked his head up ever so slightly, exposing his vulnerable blue eyes. "What is that thing?" His voice could barely keep up with his own breaths. The shepherd tried to explain. Stay here. I need to call Cyrus." The sentence had barely left his mouth when Chase stopped cold, a realization hitting him like a car on the road. The only way to contact the ACG now was through the special pup tag they had given him. A pup tag which he had thrown aside in the boiler room, along with his only weapon. "Shit!" Chase said quietly, darting his eyes around as he cursed himself over and over for discarding the only means of communication he had. He had to get back to Sky, get back and retrieve his gun and tag. He just had to get back to the elevator. "Chase?" Marshall quivered, starting to hyperventilate. "Just stay in here," growled the shepherd as he took a step outside the kennel into the rain. The most violent, brutal clanging sound suddenly howled through the air, deafening all four dogs as a metal roof was kicked out, steel bolts and fillings flying off and dropping to the floor like used cigarettes. The rest of Rubble's kennel quickly caved in, crashing to the ground in a large scrap heap as dust filled the air. Chase instantly retracted back into Marshall's den like a fearful turtle. There was a solid moment of silence in the air, nothing but the rain hitting the roofs able to be heard. Swallowing his instincts, Chase crept forward again, peeking outside. From his position, he could see the ruins of the yellow kennel, nothing more than a massive pile of wood and metal. Keeping as low as he could, Chase couldn't take his eyes off the wreckage, too fearful to make the smallest move. A distant hissing sound filled the air of the clearing, which quickly darkened into low, bear-like growling. Then it stood up. The creature stood on four legs and reared up to its full, terrifying height, no longer bound by the low ceiling of the kennel. Chase's eyes widened at its height, watching it rise high above the kennels as its head picked up. The puppy stood horrified at the sight. The monster's body resembled that of a degloved, four-legged monster. It was composed entirely of a long, thin skeleton, crudely wrapped in bleeding raw muscles and pulsating organs that shone in the wet rain. Blue veins wrapped around its torso, bleeding down its arms and up its neck like netting. Intestine-like organs wrapped down its legs like ribbons, as if it had stolen Rubble's insides to build up its body. It was a creature that haunted nightmares, a sentient monster of gore and innards that lurked within the darkness of the mind. Its head was the only vaguely normal feature. It was the head of a shepherd-like dog, only it was torn and shredded along the mouth and around the eye sockets. One of its tall ears was ripped apart, making one wonder if it was merely a skin mask for the grotesque animal that wore it. Chase briefly questioned how a monster that erupted from a bulldog would look like a shepherd, until he remembered that Ferox Malice likely carried the DNA of anyone and everyone it infected, even between different bodies. Then another thought entered his mind, overriding the previous one. Had Rubble cut the mask from a victim long ago and was merely keeping it stored away until it was time? Chase couldn't figure out which scenario he preferred. For all he knew, the face it wore could have belonged to a poor dog that fell victim to the monster a long time ago. It was near impossible to see any trace of Rubble in the monster. His organs and innards had been assimilated into Ferox Malice's body, with the remains of dozens of others long absorbed within it. Ferox Malice quivered in place for a moment, seemingly twitching as if it was getting accustomed to being exposed again. Chase swore it was a trick of the eyes, but he drew back in horror as intestine-like tentacles began to emit from the monster's back. They writhed like living worms, almost with a mind of their own, tearing out of Ferox Malice like squirming appendages. Taking a deep breath of air, Ferox Malice raised its elongated front leg, so thin it couldn't have been more than a few inches in diameter, and planted it down in the mud, its paws built from clumps of muscle mass, with long, razor-like claws jutting out. "Dear God," Chase could barely whisper as he watched from Marshall's kennel, sounding more like a cry. Taking a few large, slow steps forward, Ferox Malice growled as it looked around, curling its lips to reveal glistening fangs. Scanning the clearing, The ears of its mask pricked as blood dripped from its mouth. Its body emitted sounds as it moved. The paws, if one could even call them that, would scrunch into the ground, tapping its claws impatiently. Its bones almost constantly popped, each movement, each step, radiating the same sound anyone would when cracking their knuckles. A thin tail that consisted of a single rope-like strand of intestine followed it, gracefully moving through the air. Despite having no skin below the neck and being a mere amalgamation of bone and muscle, an unnatural physicality kept its body functioning to near perfection. Cyrus did say it escaped from a facility, likely under the noses of hundreds of scientists studying its fascinating biology. After a moment, it reared back its head, taking in a large gulp of air, then snapped forward, unhinging its fanged mouth and releasing a distressing, inhumane, and animalistic roar that penetrated the air. Its screech was loud, cutting into Chase's eardrums and forcing them open, reaching its claws in and gripping his brain. Marshall threw himself under his bed as the scream filled the air, while Rocky retracted under his table. Zuma stood in his den wide-eyed, the monster's roar freezing him in place, swirling around him like a tornado of fire. The scream Ferox Malice emitted was an unholy combination of several noises. The sounds of people screaming for their lives, old and young, dogs, and cats wailing in agony as they were cornered, and other screams from countless living that would be impossible to label. All victims, all their voices and tongues were stolen away to produce one terrible sound emitted from its maw. The roar seemed to have an effect on those around it. Chase, for a moment, felt oddly calm, but he quickly snapped back to reality as he watched the creature. The monster of gore breathed out a feral snarl, then began walking out of view as its worm-like tail followed behind it. Chase quickly eyed the elevator to the tower. The urge to sprint for it was incredible. His vision trailed to the kennels, all dormant vehicles waiting to be activated. Was it even possible to drive away? The simple act of starting an engine would immediately alert the creature with its noise, exposing the driver as if it was a giant spotlight shining on them. It was too dangerous of an option, prompting a whimper from Chase as he looked back toward the elevator. Blinking in confusion, he realized Ferox Malice had completely left his field of vision, leaving him with Marshall in a storm of terror and uncertainty. Looking back, he spotted the small head of a Dalmatian peeking under a bed. The spotted puppy was visibly breaking down. "What's happening?" Marshall squeaked, tears forming streaks down his cheeks. Grimacing, Chase crept over to his friend and tried to speak as softly as he could. "Marshall, do you remember those drills we practiced? Where I would make everyone get under a table and be quiet?" The Dalmatian nodded. "Well, this is what we practiced for," he sighed, trying to hide his own fearfulness. "Hide, and do not come out until I say so. I'm handling this." The smaller dog nodded as he further hid under the bed. "Okay." Trying to regain his composure, Chase turned and took a step outside. A pounding thump suddenly sounded, directly above them on the kennel. It was so abrasive and quick, the whole den swayed. The shepherd froze mid-step, turning back to see Marshall about to scream, already opening his mouth. Within a second, Chase jumped across the floor and clamped his paw over the Dalmatian's mouth, suppressing his cry. The sound of something large slowly dragged itself onto the roof above them, scratching its claws along the metal roof, hissing as it gained higher ground. Chase had to nearly suffocate Marshall as he drove his paw into the Dalmatian's mouth. The spotted dog was shaking, losing control of himself, and in one wrong move, he would panic and doom them all. A long, slithering appendage of intestines suddenly dropped down in front of the entrance right before the puppy's eyes. Marshall was still silenced, but his eyes went wide, and Chase couldn't help but draw back himself. They stood motionless as Farrak's malice tail slowly slithered around, briefly grazing over the floor of the kennel. It pulled to the side out of view as Farrak's malice turned around, stalking on the roof as its body bristled. Unsatisfied, it growled and moved off the kennel, Chase continuing to hold his friend down as they witnessed its legs step down in front of them. It was hunting them. It would not leave the area until every single living creature in the area was ripped apart and consumed. It was unclear just how intelligent it was. Was it truly overlooking its prey in the obvious kennels, or was it merely toying with them? Farrak's malice was a malicious creature, but was it so sadistic it basked in the fear and suffering of others? Chase watched it skulk away, walking off as it went around the back of the tower, its tentacles and tails trailing behind it like bloodied, floating ribbons. The creature was unnaturally fast, its slow moving at the beginning merely being that of a morning stretch. It moved quickly, walking through the clearing in only a few seconds. Chase shuddered at the thought of it running. If there was any window of time, it was now. "I'm going," Chase said as he released Marshall, who collapsed to the floor. His friend attempted to respond, but he made a small choking noise, then suddenly threw up on the floor. The intense anxiety and confusion had taken control of his stomach from him. "Like I said, hide," the shepherd repeated one last time, grimacing at Marshall's condition. Taking a deep breath, Chase walked out of the kennel into the rain, exposing himself in the open. At first, he tried to stay low, walking past each kennel and getting glimpses of the others hiding. He couldn't hear or see the creature, only distant growls and faint rustling noises. Moving felt like ages, but the shepherd didn't dare to do anything more than a crouched walk. Even his tail dragging in the mud behind him was making him paranoid, a sudden urge to cough tickling up his throat. Heart beating seemingly louder than the overhead thunder, Chase crawled through the open doors of the elevator. He had to get back to the boiler room, retrieve his gun and radio, and it would all be over. He cursed himself for not seeing it in rubble earlier. Surely there had been some early warning sign that he was not himself. Whatever it had been, it completely flew over his head. Careful to not make a sound, he reached a paw out to the buttons. The sound of busting metal filled the air, making Chase jump in surprise. He jerked away and looked around fearfully, but he saw nothing. In that instance, the lights of the elevator flickered before completely going dead, bathing him in darkness. What? The puppy quivered, racing to the buttons and pressing them. The elevator was unresponsive, even as he hit every button he could. "No," he breathed out, beginning to panic. "You bastard!" It cut the power and completely blocked off the elevator access. Farrak's malice had actually found the outside breaker box, the hub for all electric systems of the tower, and damaged it. How in the world did it know to do that? How would it even know what a breaker box was? How would it even have the cognitive understanding to know to destroy it? Chase shuddered as hundreds of questions filled his mind, terror rising as he realized how exposed he was. Ferox Malice was more than any kind of animal the world had ever seen. The way it tore down the solid metal that was Rubble's kennel, the sheer amount of hysteria that it caused just from emerging, and its intelligence Cyrus had warned him so desperately about. It clearly possessed a high cognitive, almost human level of understanding and problem solving. To deliberately recognize an advantage and snap it like a twig, hunting was its dreaded strength, and its ability to hide within bodies as a mere cell. It was a beautiful predator, animalistic perfection in every sense of the word, a higher organism among static-minded animals, a true perfect creature. Chase frantically looked around, trying to find anywhere to go. He was a sitting duck in the opened, deactivated elevator. All it would take is a passing glance inside to see him. If the monster was truly toying with them, how long until it ended the game, forcing them into the kennels and tearing them apart one by one? Without thinking, Chase ran, jumping out of the elevator and running to the nearest kennel. He sprinted into Zuma's place, quickly getting against the wall. The lab jumped in surprise at the action. "Ah!" said the frightened dog, quickly recoiling. "Dude, don't do that!" "Quiet!" snapped the shepherd, motioning for him to shut up. "I need to get upstairs." "Why? You can't leave us down here." "I left... There's a radio in the boiler room." He quickly corrected himself. "If I get it back, I can alert the ACG and get them here to contain that thing." "So why don't you?" Zuma said, looking around fearfully. The distant sound of growling was circling the tower, and he quickly lowered himself and moved into a corner. "Because that thing cut the power!" Zuma's eyes went wide. "It knew how to do that?" "I don't know what it knows," Chase said, his voice shaking. "And I'm not going to take any chances with it either." "Well, now what?" the lab said with a hiss. "Are we just going to die here?" No, I have a plan," he reassured. "Stay here." "I wasn't fucking going anywhere else," Zuma growled, retracting further. Taking a brief look outside, Chase caught a glimpse of what he thought were tentacles disappearing behind some trees. The rain made it difficult to see, and he knew Ferox Malice had no intention of leaving. Slipping outside, he quickly made his way over to Rocky's kennel, trying to ignore the pounding distress in his heart. He tried as hard as he could to show the other dogs he wasn't afraid. Yet a part of him wanted to crawl under a bed and hide until all the noises ceased for good. He came to the front door of the green kennel and saw that the door had been closed. Looking around fearfully, Chase tapped the door. "Rocky, it's me. Open the door." No response. "Rocky, come on!" he hissed, knowing how vulnerable he was out in the open. "It's me!" After several uncomfortable seconds outside, he heard the mix shuffle up to the door and nose it open. "Chase!" He was interrupted as the shepherd wedged his own nose under the door and forced it open, jumping inside. The officer shut the door as quickly as he entered, breathing heavily as he turned to his gray friend. "I just can't sit out there forever, you know!" "Sorry." Rocky lowered his head, then looked out. "That thing, what is it?" "I don't really know," Chase said, looking over at Rocky's tools. "But it's lethal and pissed off." "What are we supposed to do?" The mix silently started hyperventilating. "We're just puppies!" "I have a plan." The shepherd nodded, then turned back to his friend. "But I need your help." "My help?" Coming forward to the mix and sitting down in front of him, Chase reached out with his front paws and grabbed Rocky's shoulders, pulling him close. Rocky, you need to listen to me. The mix nodded, although uncertain. I don't know anyone better with machines than you, he explained. I need you to go out there. What? Rocky recoiled in his grip. What? It's really simple. The simplest thing you could ever do, Chase assured him, keeping a hold on the mix. I need you to look at the breaker box and find out how we can fix it. We need power back in the tower. It's imperative. There's no one else here who would know how to do something like that, he said, drawing out his word to make sure Rocky was processing it. I'd go with you, but 2 would draw more attention and probably get us both killed. Go out there? Rocky breathed. With that thing walking around? If you see it or hear it, hide, the shepherd explained. Be as quiet as possible. Do not run unless absolutely necessary. Does it have heat vision? Chase blinked, looking aside for a moment. I mean, Cyrus never really said anything about that. If it did, it probably would have found all of us by now. He didn't want to scare the mix any more than he probably already had been, but running was likely a death sentence. If Farrak's malice was truly as fast as he was suspecting, trying to outrun it was not an option. Rocky stammered, shaking. Get over there, Chase instructed. Look over the breakers, come back and tell me how you can fix it. Hide if you see or hear anything. Got it? After a moment, Rocky nodded fearfully. I'm counting on you. Chase licked his friend's nose, trying to get his tail wagging, smiling, or anything to ease his fears. The storm surged overhead as Rocky left his kennel. His legs were shaking as he stepped outside into his worst nightmare. Rain, he breathed out, cringing to himself. He was willing to brave the water for the sake of the mission, but he was beyond uncomfortable. It was the worst experience Rocky had ever put himself into. Not only was he walking out into the groping hands of the cold rain, but there was actively a threat lurking outside seeking to tear him to pieces. A shiver ran through his body as he was already freezing cold. Okay, he breathed to himself, glancing behind him. Breaker box. Willing his paws to finally start moving, he crept past Zuma's kennel, wincing as he waded through a puddle that came up to his chest. Horrid memories returned to him the farther he sunk into the mud, creeping up his neck and staining his fur with dirty sludge. Leering static began to leach into his head as he passed the elevator, a distant ringing in his ears as his breathing quickened. Looking around, he didn't see Farrak's malice anywhere. Had it walked off? Shaking his head of the noise and static, Rocky crept behind the tower, keeping an eye out and doing his best to mentally block out the cold. The blades of grass that brushed against his stomach as he passed over were bringing back dark memories. But all he wanted now was to prove that he wasn't weak. He barely survived the ACG's brutality. Rocky knew it hard he was the patrol's weakling. That had to change. Facing death was not the method he had planned on using. He turned the corner, checking his surroundings. Farrak's malice was again nowhere to be seen, and Rocky raised an eyebrow. Suddenly, his heart sank as a realization hit him, and he slowly looked upwards. He saw nothing but the sky, and he let out a sigh of relief, although anxiety still churned within him. Finally approaching the large breaker box that sat bolted into the wall, the mix could already see sparks flying out of it. With one final look around, Rocky hurried over in front of it and investigated the damage. The box had been smashed inwards, likely from Farrak's malice striking it bluntly. The damage was minimal, but still left the tower powerless. The breakers for the elevator and upper floors were completely destroyed and would have to be entirely replaced. Not all the breakers had been broken, however, as Rocky could see the one labeled Basement Systems was still on a green light. I didn't know we had a basement, he thought aloud, then wondered if it was where Ryder had been building their things all these years. It could be repaired, but he knew he'd need a special tool. The breakers had to be carefully removed and possibly rewired just for good measure. He needed a particular tool to remove the breakers from the box, a tool he absolutely didn't have. But if Ryder completed most of his builds in the basement, it was a likely location to find it. Rocky nodded and turned to head back. The ground suddenly moved from beneath him, making him sway and taking the mix off guard. He stumbled to keep himself standing, his fear returning to him as he was unsure of even moving. A large fuzzy gopher quickly popped out of the ground, spraying dirt across a small radius. It seemed scared, and Rocky was about to approach it when his instincts suddenly froze his step. The gopher ran away, seemingly from nothing, as fast as its little legs could carry it. Like a bullet through the air, a bloody tentacle shot out of the tall grass, completely skewering through the gopher's body like a spear. Biting back a scream, Rocky backed away as the screaming rodent was lifted off the ground, the appendage firmly ensnaring through it. Emerging from the darkness, Farak's malice stood up as it stared down at its prey, its tail brutally speared through it. It had been waiting, sitting patiently as it somehow lured the animal out of its safety. The gopher was lifted up before the creature's eyes, tiny gurgled screams filling the air as the predator stared into it. Overcome with fear, Rocky broke into a sprint, his mind going into override and spiking his flight instinct. All he could hear was the carnage, as the gopher's screams were pulled from its vocal cords and swallowed by the monster. The static in his head seemed to explode, almost fully taking control of him as he ran dangerously close to the creature as he passed. Rocky finally tore back into his kennel, sobbing as he dove inside. Chase quickly shut the door and wrapped the terrified Mix in a hug. They had made progress now, but Farak's malice wasn't finished with them yet.